At 0742 on May 27, 1940, Captain Jack Churchill crouched behind a crumbling stone wall near the French village of L'Épinay, watching 5 German soldiers advance through the morning mist toward his position. 33 years old, 14 years since Sandhurst, 0 confirmed kills in combat. The Wehrmacht had already crushed Poland in 36 days. Now their panzers were tearing through France at 40 meters per day, and the entire British expeditionary force was running for the sea. Churchill's company had lost 11 men in the past 72 hours. The Germans had better tanks, better aircraft, better coordination. British soldiers were dying by the hundreds along every road leading to Dunkirk. The retreat had become a rout. Officers were burning classified documents in ditches. Sergeants were burying equipment they could not carry. Private soldiers were throwing away their rifles just to run faster toward the coast. But Jack Churchill was not running. He was carrying a 6-foot English longbow, 70 pounds of draw weight, effective range of 200 yards in the hands of an expert archer. And Churchill was an expert. He had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo just 11 months earlier. 26th place out of 63 competitors from 14 nations. Not a champion, but good enough to put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards. Good enough to kill a man before that man ever heard the shot. The German patrol was now at 30 yards. Close enough. Churchill could see the sergeant leading them, a veteran by the look of his careful movements. Probably a man who had fought through the Polish campaign. The sergeant was scanning the hedge, checking windows, looking for the standard threats: rifles, machine guns, grenades. He never thought to look for a medieval weapon. Churchill drew the bowstring back to his ear. The yew wood creaked under the tension. His fingers found the familiar anchor position on the string, the same position he had used 10,000 times in practice. He had made this exact shot countless times at targets. He had never made it with a human being at the other end. The arrow flew. The German sergeant dropped without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his chest. It was the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century. It would be the last confirmed longbow kill of the entire Second World War. And it happened because one British officer refused to accept that modern warfare had made ancient weapons obsolete. The British Army did not know what to do with Jack Churchill. He had graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1926 and served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma. He had spent a decade learning to be a conventional infantry officer. Then he had quit the army entirely in 1936 because peacetime soldiering bored him to exhaustion. He had worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya. He had appeared in films as an archer and a bagpipe player, including a small role in The Thief of Baghdad. He had ridden motorcycles 1,500 meters across Burma and India, once crashing into a water buffalo on a rural road. When war broke out in September 1939, Churchill immediately rejoined his regiment, but he did not rejoin as a normal officer. He brought his longbow, the same weapon he had used in international competition. He brought his Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore of the type his ancestors had carried into battle centuries earlier. And he brought a set of Highland bagpipes that he had taught himself to play during his years in Burma. His fellow officers thought he was eccentric at best, mentally unstable at worst. His commanding officers thought he was a liability. The War Office had no regulation covering officers who wished to carry medieval weapons into battle against panzer divisions armed with 88mm guns. Churchill did not care what any of them thought. He had studied military history extensively. He knew that modern rifles were more accurate than long bows at long range. He knew that a Mauser could fire 15 rounds per minute, while a longbow could lose perhaps 10. But he also knew something that the tacticians in London had forgotten. In close combat, in the chaos of an ambush, in the terror of hand-to-hand fighting, psychological warfare mattered as much as raw firepower. A man charging at you with a broadsword and a Highland war cry was more terrifying than a man pointing a rifle from cover. And a man who could kill you silently with an arrow before you even knew he was there had an advantage that no amount of modern technology could match. The British Expeditionary Force evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk between May 26 and June 4, 1940. Most of them left behind their weapons, their vehicles, their equipment, their pride. They came home defeated, exhausted, expecting a German invasion within weeks. Jack Churchill came home with his bow, his sword, and his bagpipes. He had covered the retreat of his company. He had killed enemy soldiers with weapons that belonged in a museum, and he was just getting started. If you want to see how Churchill's medieval arsenal performed against the Wehrmacht's elite forces, please hit that like button. It really helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Churchill. Within weeks of returning from Dunkirk, Churchill volunteered for a new unit that the War Office was secretly forming. They called themselves the Commandos. The training would be brutal beyond anything the British Army had ever attempted. The missions would be suicidal raids into Nazi-occupied territory. The casualty rates were expected to be catastrophic. Churchill requested permission to bring his sword and bow on operations. The Commandos said yes. By December 1941, he would be leading men onto a frozen Norwegian beach at dawn, bagpipes screaming into the Arctic wind, broadsword raised above his head, about to prove that sometimes the oldest ways of war were still the deadliest. The British Commandos were born from desperation. In June 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The army had lost most of its equipment at Dunkirk. An invasion seemed imminent. Prime Minister Winston Churchill demanded a force that could strike back at the enemy, even if only to prove that Britain was still fighting. The concept was simple but brutal. Small teams of highly trained soldiers would raid the coastlines of occupied Europe. They would destroy facilities, kill Germans, gather intelligence, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. The missions would be dangerous. The training would be harder. Volunteers only. Jack Churchill volunteered immediately. He joined No. 3 Commando in late 1940 and threw himself into the brutal conditioning program that transformed civilians into elite raiders. The Commandos trained in Scotland, where the mountains were steep, the weather was ruthless, and the instructors accepted nothing less than complete commitment. Churchill thrived. He was 34 years old, older than most of the recruits, but he outlasted men half his age on forced marches, carrying 60-pound rucksacks. He mastered unarmed combat techniques that could kill a man in seconds. He learned how to board enemy vessels from small boats in the darkness, how to navigate by stars when maps were useless, how to survive for days on almost no food or water. And he never stopped carrying his bow and sword. Other commandos thought it was theatrical nonsense. The instructors thought it was dangerous eccentricity. They were all wrong. On December 27, 1941, Jack Churchill proved that medieval weapons still had a place in modern war. Operation Archery was meant to be a simple raid on the Norwegian island of Vagsø. German forces had established a small garrison there to protect shipping lanes along the coast. British intelligence estimated roughly 150 German troops on the island, mostly garrison personnel who had not seen serious combat. Churchill's unit would land before dawn, destroy the garrison, burn the fish oil factories that supplied German submarines, and evacuate before reinforcements arrived. The plan was sound. The execution would be chaotic. Churchill stood in the bow of the landing craft as it approached the beach, bagpipes in his hands, playing the March of the Cameron Men as loudly as the instrument would allow. The sound carried across the water, echoing off the frozen cliffs of the Norwegian coast. German sentries heard it and assumed they were hallucinating. No rational soldier would announce his arrival to the enemy with Scottish battle music. Churchill was not interested in rationality. He wanted the Germans confused, terrified, convinced they were facing something supernatural. The landing craft hit the beach at 0600 hours. Churchill leapt out first, still playing the pipes, charging up the snow-covered slope toward the German positions. His commandos followed behind him, rifles firing, grenades exploding, voices screaming the war cries that Churchill had taught them. The Germans opened fire from concrete bunkers 100 yards inland. Machine gun bullets kicked up snow around Churchill's feet. He never stopped playing. He reached cover behind a large rock, finally put down the pipes, and drew his broadsword. The Germans had retreated into a fortified building, a sturdy structure with firing slits and reinforced walls. Churchill's unit had no artillery support, no tanks, no time to wait for naval gunfire. They had to take the building with small arms and explosives, close quarters fighting against entrenched defenders. Churchill organized an assault team, 6 men carrying grenades and submachine guns. He led them personally, sword in hand, running directly at the German position while his men provided covering fire. The Germans shot at him from the windows, bullets ricocheting off the stones around him. He reached the door, kicked it open, and went inside. What happened next would become legend among the commandos, though the exact details were never officially recorded. Churchill claimed he killed 5 German soldiers in close combat, using the sword to cut down men who were fumbling with rifles in the cramped darkness of the building's interior. His men confirmed they saw Churchill wielding the sword with terrifying efficiency, moving through the rooms like a figure from a medieval battlefield transported into the 20th century. The Germans surrendered, not because they were outnumbered, not because they lacked ammunition, but because they had no idea how to fight an enemy who attacked with bagpipes and swords and absolute disregard for their own survival. Churchill's unit captured 98 prisoners that day, destroyed the German garrison, burned the factories to the ground, and evacuated without losing a single man killed. Churchill received his first Distinguished Service Order for the operation, though the official citation did not mention the bagpipes or the sword. The commando leadership did not know how to explain to senior officers that one of their best commanders was fighting like a Highland clan warrior from the 18th century. By 1943, Jack Churchill had become one of the most feared commando officers in the British Army, though his reputation was built as much on psychology as on tactics. German intelligence reports described him as reckless and unpredictable, an officer who led from the front with primitive weapons and seemed immune to fear. Wehrmacht soldiers who had encountered him in Norway and Italy spread stories about the British madman with the sword and the pipes, the officer who charged machine gun nests as if bullets could not touch him. The Germans were not entirely wrong. Churchill had survived dozens of engagements where most men would have been killed. He had led assaults on German positions in Norway, Italy, and the Balkans. He had been shot at, mortared, and bombed. He had walked through minefields that killed men standing next to him. And he kept coming back for more. In September 1943, Churchill received orders for a new operation in the Mediterranean. British forces were struggling to break through German defensive lines in Italy. The Germans had fortified every mountain pass, every river crossing, every strategic position that could slow the Allied advance. The fighting was brutal, the progress agonizingly slow. Churchill's commando unit was ordered to support the main advance by conducting raids on German communication lines and supply depots behind enemy lines. They would operate with minimal support, living off the land, relying on speed and surprise rather than overwhelming force. Churchill immediately volunteered to lead the deepest raids, the missions that required his men to penetrate furthest into enemy territory. His commanding officer warned him that these operations had casualty rates above 50%. Churchill said he would take the assignment anyway. Between September and December 1943, Churchill led 15 separate raids into German-held territory in Italy. His unit destroyed supply depots, ambushed convoys, cut telephone lines, and captured dozens of prisoners. The Germans began to recognize his pattern. He always attacked at dawn or dusk when light was poor. He always used the terrain to his advantage, approaching targets from directions the Germans considered impassable. And he always led from the front, often the first man into enemy positions, always armed with his sword. German officers increased security around their supply routes. They posted extra sentries. They established more frequent patrols. They set ambushes, hoping to catch Churchill's unit between safe houses. It did not work. Churchill was too experienced, too careful, and too lucky. On December 27, 1943, exactly 2 years after the Vagso raid, Churchill led 40 commandos on an assault against a German hilltop position overlooking the town of Pigolato in central Italy. German forces held the high ground with machine guns, mortars, and clear fields of fire covering every approach. British infantry had tried to take the position twice in the past week, losing over 100 men in failed assaults. Churchill studied the terrain and told his commanding officer he could take the position with 40 men if they attacked at night without artillery preparation. The plan was simple. Churchill's unit would climb the steep backside of the hill under cover of darkness, using a route the Germans considered too difficult for infantry to navigate. They would reach the German positions just before dawn, when sentries were exhausted from night watch and visibility was worst. Then they would attack with bayonets and grenades, fighting hand to hand before the Germans could organize effective resistance. The assault began at 0400 hours. Churchill led his men up the hill in complete silence. No talking, no coughing, no sound except the occasional scrape of boots on stone. They reached the German position at 0545, just as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. Churchill drew his sword and whispered the signal. The commandos attacked. The Germans never had a chance to establish organized defense. Churchill's men came through the darkness like ghosts, bayonets flashing, grenades exploding, voices screaming. The Germans panicked. Many threw down their rifles and surrendered immediately. Others tried to fight back and were killed in seconds. Churchill fought his way to the German command bunker, sword in hand, 2 commandos covering him with Thompson submachine guns. He kicked open the door and found 12 German soldiers inside, all of them armed, none of them willing to shoot. They raised their hands. Churchill accepted their surrender, then walked outside to organize the defense of the position before German reinforcements arrived. His unit held the hilltop for 12 hours against repeated German counterattacks, finally withdrawing at nightfall with only 3 men wounded and 42 German prisoners captured. Churchill received his 2nd Distinguished Service Order for the operation. By this point, senior British officers were running out of medals to give him. In May 1944, Jack Churchill was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a force of 1,500 partisan fighters in Yugoslavia. His mission was to tie down German divisions that might otherwise be sent to defend France against the coming Allied invasion. The partisan war in Yugoslavia was nothing like conventional combat. There were no front lines, no clear battles, no safe rear areas. German forces controlled the cities and major roads, but partisan fighters controlled the mountains and forests. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides executed prisoners. It was a war where survival often depended on ruthlessness rather than honor. Churchill refused to operate that way. He insisted that his fighters treat prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. He forbade reprisal executions. He personally intervened when partisan commanders wanted to kill captured German soldiers in revenge for earlier massacres. His fighters thought he was naive. German commanders thought he was weak. But Churchill knew something that both sides had forgotten. Treating prisoners humanely gave enemy soldiers a reason to surrender rather than fight to the death. It turned every captured German into a propaganda victory, proof that British forces could be trusted. And it reduced the likelihood that German forces would execute Allied prisoners in retaliation. Churchill's approach worked. Between May and September 1944, his partisan force captured over 500 German soldiers with minimal casualties. They disrupted German supply lines throughout northwestern Yugoslavia, forcing the Wehrmacht to commit additional divisions to an area that should have been a quiet rear zone. And Churchill personally led every major operation, always at the front, always armed with his sword. On September 14, 1944, Churchill's partisan force ambushed a German convoy near the island of Brock off the Dalmatian coast. Intelligence had reported the convoy was carrying supplies and perhaps 50 soldiers. The actual convoy consisted of 200 German troops with heavy weapons and radio equipment. Churchill's force was outnumbered 2-1 and caught in the open when German reinforcements arrived. The firefight lasted for 6 hours. Churchill's fighters held their position, inflicting heavy casualties on the German column, but they could not withdraw without being overrun. German mortars bracketed their position. Machine gun fire pinned them down. By mid-afternoon, Churchill realized they were surrounded. He gathered his senior fighters and told them to scatter into the mountains, while he held the German force in place. His fighters refused. They would all break out together, or none of them would. Churchill organized one final assault, leading his remaining fighters in a desperate charge against the weakest point in the German line. They broke through, but Churchill was hit by mortar fragments during the retreat. He went down hard, bleeding from shrapnel wounds in his legs and chest. His fighters dragged him into cover and tried to evacuate him, but German troops were closing in from all sides. Churchill ordered his men to leave him behind. They refused again. In the end, Churchill was carried out by 4 partisan fighters who refused to abandon him, even as German soldiers shot at them from 50 yards away. They reached the tree line and collapsed into cover, all of them wounded, all of them exhausted. Churchill had lost consciousness from blood loss. His fighters bandaged his wounds and carried him 15 miles through the mountains to a safe house, where a British doctor managed to stabilize his condition. Churchill spent 2 weeks recovering in a partisan camp before insisting he was ready to return to operations. His doctors told him he should evacuate to Italy for proper medical care. Churchill said he would consider it after one more mission. That mission came on September 29, 1944. Churchill was leading 40 partisans on a raid against a German radio station when they walked into a German ambush. The Germans had been tracking partisan movements for weeks and had finally predicted Churchill's likely routes. They hit his force with overwhelming fire from 3 sides, killing 10 of his fighters in the first minutes. Churchill tried to organize a defense, but his remaining fighters were pinned down with no cover and no way to retreat. German soldiers closed in with grenades and submachine guns. One of Churchill's fighters detonated a grenade next to a German position, giving the others a chance to pull back. Churchill was the last man moving when the mortar shell landed 10 feet behind him. The explosion threw him forward onto his face, knocking him unconscious. When he woke up, he was lying on his back with a German rifle pointed at his head. His sword was gone. His partisan fighters were dead or captured. Churchill was a prisoner of war. The Germans did not know who they had captured at first. Churchill was wearing civilian clothes mixed with pieces of British uniform, standard practice for anyone working with partisan fighters. He carried no identification papers. He refused to tell his captors anything except his name, rank, and service number, as required by the Geneva Convention. The Germans assumed he was a regular British officer who had been advising partisan forces. They sent him to a standard POW camp in northern Italy, where he was held with hundreds of other Allied officers awaiting transfer to Germany. Churchill should have been relieved. POW camps in Italy were relatively humane. Food was scarce, but prisoners were treated according to international law. The war would be over within a year, and Churchill would go home with an extraordinary record of service. But Churchill had no intention of sitting out the rest of the war behind barbed wire. Within 2 weeks of his capture, he was already planning his escape. POW camps were designed to contain men who had given up. They were not designed to contain Jack Churchill. The POW camp at Sulmona, Italy, held approximately 900 Allied prisoners in October 1944. Security was moderate. German guards walked the perimeter with rifles, but they were mostly older men who had been pulled from rear area units. The camp was surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire 12 feet high, with a clear space in between. Searchlights swept the compound at night. A guard tower stood at each corner, manned by soldiers with machine guns. Escapes were rare and usually unsuccessful. Churchill studied the camp for exactly 3 days before deciding he would go over the fence. Not through a tunnel, which would take months to dig and required equipment he did not have. Not by hiding in a supply truck, which was unpredictable and left escape entirely to chance. He would go over the wire at night when the guards were least alert. Other prisoners thought he was insane. Going over the wire meant climbing 12 feet of barbed wire in full view of searchlights and guard towers. It meant moving slowly enough to avoid tearing yourself apart on the wire, but quickly enough to get over before guards could shoot you. The odds of success were perhaps 1 in 20. Churchill said he would take those odds. On the night of October 17, 1944, Churchill waited until the searchlight had passed his section of fence, then ran directly at the wire. He did not try to be clever or subtle. He simply climbed. The barbed wire tore his hands and face, ripped his uniform, caught his legs and chest. He kept climbing. The searchlight swept back across his position before he reached the top. The beam illuminated him clearly. A British officer, halfway up the fence, bleeding from a dozen cuts, completely exposed. Churchill did not stop. He pulled himself over the top of the wire and dropped down on the other side, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of his lungs. The searchlight had already moved on. The guards had not seen him. Churchill picked himself up and ran into the darkness. He had no food, no maps, no supplies of any kind. He was 200 miles behind German lines in a country where Wehrmacht forces were fighting a brutal retreat against advancing Allied armies. He spoke no Italian. He had no civilian clothes. And he was about to prove that determination mattered more than planning. Churchill walked for 8 days straight, traveling only at night, hiding during the day in abandoned buildings or dense forest. He ate whatever he could find, raw vegetables from abandoned farms, berries from bushes, occasional scraps of food left behind by retreating German units. He drank from streams and rain puddles. He avoided roads where German convoys might spot him. He crossed rivers by wading through the freezing water because bridges were guarded. On the 8th day, he reached the Allied lines near the Adriatic coast. British sentries nearly shot him before recognizing his uniform. Churchill walked into the command post, reported his escape to the duty officer, and asked if there were any operations he could join. The duty officer sent him to the medical tent instead. The camp doctor treated Churchill for malnutrition, dehydration, and multiple infected cuts from the barbed wire. Churchill spent 2 days recovering, then demanded to be returned to active duty. His commanding officer sent him to Britain for debriefing instead. Churchill protested. He wanted to return to Yugoslavia and rejoin his partisan force. His commanding officer refused. Churchill's luck had finally run out in the bureaucracy. By December 1944, Churchill was back in England, officially listed as recovered from his wounds and cleared for duty. The British Army offered him a training position, teaching commando tactics to new recruits. Churchill turned it down. He requested transfer to the Pacific Theater, where fighting against Japan was expected to continue for at least another year. The War Office approved his request, but delayed his deployment for months while they processed paperwork and arranged transport. Churchill spent the winter of 1944-45 in frustration, watching the war in Europe wind down while he sat in England doing nothing. In March 1945, Churchill finally received orders to deploy to Burma. He would join British forces fighting against Japanese troops in the jungles where he had served 20 years earlier as a young officer. Churchill was 38 years old now, older than almost every officer in his unit, but he packed his sword and prepared to go to war one last time. He arrived in Burma in May 1945. Within a week, he was leading patrols into Japanese-controlled territory, using the same tactics he had perfected against Germans in Europe. Silent approaches, dawn attacks, brutal close-quarters combat. The Japanese were different enemies than the Germans. They did not surrender easily. They fought to the death rather than accept capture. But Churchill adapted. He learned to anticipate Japanese defensive positions, to recognize the signs of ambush, to exploit the weaknesses in their tactics. By July 1945, Churchill had been in continuous combat for nearly 6 years. He had fought in Norway, Italy, Yugoslavia, and Burma. He had killed enemy soldiers with bows, swords, and firearms. He had been wounded multiple times, captured once, decorated repeatedly. And he was still looking for another fight when the war ended. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The Second World War was over. Churchill's reaction was succinct and entirely in character. He later said, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years." His fellow officers thought he was joking. He was not. Jack Churchill returned to Britain in late 1945 with no clear sense of what came next. The war had defined his entire adult life. He had spent his 30s fighting across Europe and Asia, leading men in combat, surviving experiences that would haunt most veterans for decades. He returned to Britain with his military career winding down. He was 41 years old. He had fought in the greatest war in human history. He had survived wounds, capture, and concentration camps. He had earned decorations that most soldiers could only dream of, and he had no idea what to do with the rest of his life. The British Army offered him training assignments, staff positions, administrative roles. Churchill accepted them without enthusiasm. He qualified as a parachutist in his 40s, jumping from aircraft just to feel the rush of adrenaline again. He trained new generations of soldiers in commando tactics, passing on the skills he had learned in Scotland and applied across Europe. But peacetime soldiering could never match the intensity of war. Churchill needed something else, some new challenge, some way to feel alive again. He found it in the most unlikely place imaginable. The man who had fought with swords and longbows, who had stormed beaches with bagpipes screaming, who had escaped from Nazi concentration camps, was about to discover a new passion. He was about to become one of the first surfers in British history. On July 21, 1955, a 48-year-old British Army officer stood on the banks of the River Severn in Gloucestershire, England. He was holding a homemade surfboard, watching the water for signs of the tidal boor, a wave that traveled up the river from the Bristol Channel twice each day. Local fishermen thought he was mad. They had seen waves on the Severn for generations, but no one had ever tried to ride one. Jack Churchill paddled out into the brown water and waited. The boar appeared as a white line on the horizon, moving upstream against the current. It was not a large wave by ocean standards, perhaps 5 feet at its peak, but it was a wave, and Churchill was determined to ride it. He caught the boar and surfed it for over a mile upstream, becoming one of the first people in Britain to ride a river wave. It was exactly the kind of absurd, unnecessary, slightly dangerous activity that had defined his entire life. He was not content to watch the wave pass. He had to be on it, had to feel it beneath him, had to master it the way he had mastered the longbow, the broadsword, and the bagpipes. Churchill retired from the British Army in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He had served for over 30 years, fought in one world war and several smaller conflicts, earned decorations from multiple nations, and survived experiences that would have killed most men 10 times over. He was 52 years old and finally at peace with civilian life. His retirement was as eccentric as his military career. He developed a passion for radio-controlled model boats, building elaborate warships and sailing them on ponds near his home. He refurbished old steamboats and piloted them along the Thames between Richmond and Oxford. He continued to play the bagpipes at memorial ceremonies and regimental gatherings, a living connection to the commando traditions he had helped create. His daily commute became legendary among fellow train passengers. Churchill would ride the train home from London each evening, and as the train passed his neighborhood, he would open the window and throw his briefcase out onto the tracks. Startled passengers assumed he had lost his mind. In fact, Churchill had calculated the exact spot where his garden bordered the railway line. The briefcase landed in his backyard every time, saving him the trouble of carrying it from the station. When people asked about his wartime exploits, Churchill was modest. He did not boast about the Germans he had killed or the prisoners he had captured. He did not exaggerate his role in operations or claim credit for victories that belonged to others. He simply told the truth, which was extraordinary enough without embellishment. His son, Malcolm, later recalled that his father would discuss the war openly with anyone who asked, particularly over a glass of wine in the evening, but he never sought attention for his deeds. The years passed. Churchill watched the world change around him. The British Empire dissolved. The Cold War divided Europe. New technologies transformed warfare beyond recognition. Guided missiles replaced artillery. Jet aircraft replaced propeller planes. Nuclear weapons made conventional combat seem almost quaint. The kind of war Churchill had fought with swords and bagpipes and personal courage became a historical curiosity. Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. He had outlived most of his comrades from the commandos, most of his fellow prisoners from Sachsenhausen, most of the men he had led into battle across Europe. He died peacefully in Surrey, England, surrounded by family, a lifetime removed from the frozen beaches of Norway and the burning hills of Yugoslavia. The obituary struggled to capture his life. One British newspaper wrote that if Churchill had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. No fictional hero with his story would seem credible. A man who killed enemies with a long bow in the age of tanks. A man who captured prisoners with a sword in the age of machine guns. A man who played bagpipes while mortars exploded around him. A man who escaped from a Nazi concentration camp and walked 150 kilometers to freedom. A man who surfed river waves and threw briefcases from trains and refused to accept that the modern world had no place for medieval warriors. Jack Churchill was not the most decorated soldier of the Second World War. He was not the most successful commander or the most brilliant tactician. He did not win any decisive battles or change the course of history through strategic genius. What he did was simpler and perhaps more important. He proved that individual courage still mattered. He proved that unconventional thinking could overcome superior firepower. He proved that one man with enough determination could accomplish what armies could not. His legacy lives on in the commandos he helped create, in the special operations forces that traced their lineage to those Scottish training grounds. In every soldier who has ever been told that something was impossible and refused to believe it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about officers who captured prisoners with swords. Stories about soldiers who played bagpipes under mortar fire. Stories about men who escaped concentration camps and walked across mountains to fight again. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Norway? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you have ever heard of Mad Jack Churchill before today. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Jack Churchill does not disappear into silence. This man deserved to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.